thank you all for coming back. And if you don't mind, I heard just asking this helps. I started doing it, now I stopped. But I'm going to ask real quick if you can subscribe so I don't have to ask you again. Turn on those post notifications. Like this. Algorithm is killing me, people. I need some help. Thank you. Now let's get into the story. It's a good one. Tammy Leopard was a beautiful actress that was 18 years old from Rockledge, Florida. And she grew up with a bunch of pageants and modeling as well, so she even appeared on the front of CoverGirl magazine once. But you see, her real ambition was to be an actress in the movies, and she was heading in that direction when she did a low-budget film that was called Spring Break. And that led to a far bigger role when she landed a part in the movie we all know and love by Al Pacino called Scarface. Now, admittedly, she didn't have that big of a part. I mean, Tammy appears as a bikini girl lookout, but, you know, I mean, come on, this was Pacino, and this was the big time at that point. And Tammy, at that point, was on her way during 1983, where she was now able to finally move to Hollywood. But not everything was okay with Tammy's life. I mean, nobody knew exactly when it started, but everybody agreed that she was troubled. She was deeply troubled. Now, we know that she suffered a breakdown on the set of Scarface and also came back from a party from her spring break movie in a state of nervous exhaustion. And this was because she was convinced that somebody was out there and they were trying to hurt her. Now, she was paranoid, and she confided in a friend saying that she saw something at the spring break party and it could get her killed. Then after that, she kind of fell apart. I mean, she wouldn't even eat, and she accused her own friends and family of trying to poison her on multiple occasions with food. Plus, she would only drink from a sealed container. Very paranoid. And then on June 1st, 1983, she kind of just snapped, you know? And she went to her house and found a baseball bat, picked it up, started to just pace around the room, and then just started letting off these huge screams and just started smashing every single window in the home. Now, Tammy's mother, Linda Curtis, saw this as, you know, this is the last straw. We really need to get her help. There's something seriously wrong with her. So after this, she made her daughter go to a psychiatric clinic for a bunch of tests. And Tammy was tested for a bunch of things, a whole array of things. And they all came back negative. She was also examined by a psychiatrist, and the verdict was she was stressed. Yep, that was it. Or at least that's all the psychiatrist found. Okay, so after this, you know, therapy was highly recommended. But Tammy never went to therapy. For one reason, though, and I'll tell you that in a minute. You see, that same week, at around 11 a.m. on Wednesday morning, Tammy told her mom she was going to Cocoa Beach with a friend, and that friend was named Keith Rogers. Now, Linda was actually glad that her daughter was going out of the house, even if deep down she was a bit concerned about, you know, her appearance and how she looked at the moment. Because, I mean, usually she would dress to the nines and even spend hours of time just on her hair alone, especially her appearance. But today she didn't even bother at all. She didn't bother to do her hair. It was just let go. And she kind of looked like a mess and didn't dress up at all. But Linda didn't bother making a statement. Linda didn't want to comment. You know, she was just happy that Tammy was going out. You know, she just told Tammy, I love you, and, you know, I'll see you later. And Linda did love Tammy, but sadly, she would not see her later. And that's also why Tammy never went to the recommended therapy, because on July 6, 1983, Tammy disappeared out of nowhere. And Linda probably had a feeling about it because, you know, under normal circumstances, Linda would not have been anxious if her daughter was running late or, you know, not getting home on time. I mean, Tammy was young and also popular with a lot of friends. Not to mention, she stayed out past curfew before. And given her recent issues, Linda, though, was a little concerned. So with this nervous gut feeling, she started to call Tammy's friends. And started, of course, first with Keith Rogers, the young man who drove her to the beach. But what Keith had to say would become extremely troubling. He said that him and Tammy got into a huge argument, and she insisted that he drive her to the home of a different friend that was supposedly 2 hours away. And I know if you're anything like me, this is the part of the story when you start to scratch your head and be like, huh? 2 hours away? A little weird. When she could just, go right back home. Yeah, something's not adding up, but let's continue. And you see, even Keith thought that this was weird, and he actually refused to take Tammy there. And that's when Tammy told him to stop the car immediately and let her out. So that's exactly what he did, dropping her off in the parking lot outside the Glass Bank in Cocoa Beach. Then he said that he hasn't seen her since. So Linda's next call that she made was to the police. And immediately the response that she got from the police was a letdown, because they said Tammy, who is technically an adult, 18 years old, is fully entitled to do whatever she wants, even if that means, go walking around all night or going to a friend's house that's 2 hours away. And giving Linda's situation of their home life, I guess this seemed like a likely explanation to the police. I mean, they honestly were convinced that Tammy had taken a time out and would show up a little later or in the next couple of days, but it would be a full 5 days before they decided to take any meaningful action. And 5 days is a long time. I mean, we have that show, The First 48, for a reason. So when they finally start investigating, the first thing they do is question Keith Rogers appropriately. Now, and they question him about the last time he was with Tammy. And of course, he repeats the same story that he told to Linda. And then for some reason, he has never been considered a serious suspect in this disappearance of Tammy, even though Linda has insisted to investigators that Tammy, for some reason, was afraid of him. Now, we're going to take another pause, because when I got here in the story, I was like, okay, I think the last person to see her should definitely be a suspect. But at the same time, that doesn't make sense why Linda, the mother, would let her daughter Tammy go out with somebody to the beach or wherever if Tammy was afraid of him. So I feel like that was kind of thrown from left field. It doesn't make any sense. Why would the mother Linda then let Tammy go with him? Anyway, for Brevard County detectives, this very strange disappearance of Tammy is one of those frustrating cases that unfortunately never gained momentum. I mean, not one single witness could be found who saw anything on that early Wednesday morning when the sun was out and the beach was right there and they were about to walk to it. Then all of a sudden this happened. No, I'm kidding. No, but seriously, I mean, not one single witness could be found who saw anything on that early Wednesday morning. Also, none of Tammy's friends had talked to her, and they didn't have a clue where she might be. But Tammy did try to call her Aunt Ginger on the day she went missing. In fact, she made 3 calls from a payphone nearby the beach, all of which had gone through to an answering machine. Because she also tried calling a friend named Ron Abellis, and he too did not take her call. And then right after that, Tammy vanishes. And more than 4 decades later, her disappearance remains more mysterious than ever. But this story isn't over yet. I mean, what happened to Tammy? Did she disappear on her own volition, or was she taken against her own will? And to be honest, the first of those two can almost be dismissed, because a woman like Tammy, with her ambition and making it huge and wanting to go to Hollywood, was never the type to go out of the limelight and just disappear into obscurity. and whatever issues that she may have been going through, Tammy for sure still wanted to be a Hollywood star. And it is difficult to imagine that she would give all that up, all of her hard work, especially right after she got her big break. I mean, this tells me that it's almost certainly the case that Tammy was forcibly abducted. Or she could have been lured into a place or a van or something like that, because she did have extreme paranoia. But people that have extreme paranoia are usually on guard about the simplest of things, especially if it was to come from a stranger or someone she didn't know. So I would bet to guess that she was taken by somebody that knew her with force. And then we can go back to that spring break movie party. I mean, that's where Tammy's mental issues stem from. And she even confided in a friend. Remember how she said that she saw something at the party that could get her killed? I mean, what could she have witnessed that was so horrible of a crime that could get her killed? Was it a murder? Well, her mother, Linda, was convinced that it actually had something to do with the drug trade or money laundering. I'm not sure how she came to this conclusion, but I do assume that she has been in the depths of this way more than me and has done way more research on her daughter, so I am just going to take her word on this. And Linda was so convinced that Tammy was murdered to prevent her from talking about what she accidentally saw, and Linda claimed that her daughter filed a report with the police, even though they insist there is no such report on file. Now this is getting interesting. Now, there's a real possibility that Tammy was actually killed in some drug-related hit. But if we're going to figure out who this is, things are about to get very, very tricky, because if it wasn't a hit, then that means it could have been random violence. And Tammy was very attractive, and she was a woman who would definitely turn heads, and maybe on that day she attracted the wrong kind of attention. Maybe she was taken by a predator that seemed keen on her that night when they saw her. Now wait, I only mention this theory because at that exact same time when Tammy disappeared, two of Florida's most notorious serial killers were actually kind of in connection to this case. Now, the first of these was Christopher Wilder, the so-called beauty queen killer. And let's remember, Tammy used to do pageants and did modeling. But, you know, when it came to Christopher, he was actually a millionaire and owned a construction company, but his sadistic side was torturing and killing beautiful women. And this was his MO. You know, he would approach a potential victim and introduce himself as a photographer. And then he would lure innocent women to an isolated spot, saying that he would, you know, take pictures of her for a fashion magazine. And Chris was extremely convincing. And he was also very hard-headed and very persuasive. And at least 9 beautiful ladies fell for this ruse, and unfortunately, none of them made it out alive. And Chris was eventually killed in a shootout with police in 1984. But there's absolutely no doubt that Chris would have been interested in Tammy. The real question is, would she have been interested in him? Because Chris's victims were typically naive young women who just wanted the prospect of a modeling career. But Tammy already had a career and is unlikely to have been interested in some unknown photographer. And the police say that they did investigate Christopher Wilder as a possible suspect, but eventually ruled him out. Now, the other psychopath at that time that lived in Florida, who is also sometimes mentioned along with this case, is John Brennan Crutchley. Now, this man is very disturbed, and he was obsessed with blood. I mean, he even once kidnapped a woman, tied her to a table, drained off half of her blood, which he then drank. And although he is suspected in as many as 30 deaths, he actually was never convicted of murder. Instead, he received a life sentence for kidnapping and sexual assault. Now, John typically targeted hitchhikers, so it was possible that he did pick Tammy up on the road. However, there was no evidence that has been found, at least to this day, to link him to Tammy's disappearance, so we're back at square one. But mind you, these were just two prolific serial killers. There were some serious psychos on the loose in that area during this time. And this doesn't account for every other psycho that wasn't caught and your average criminal. Don't forget about them. You got to remember that predators are all around us. And think about poor Tammy, who was so paranoid about having to go face to face with any harm, sadly ended up probably getting exactly what she did not want. Now, somebody probably took and possibly killed Tammy. I hope for some reason that she ran away, just because I like to think that she is still alive. And who knows, maybe she had a reason for disappearing. But if I was an investigating man like I am, and a betting man like I am, I would have never ruled out Keith as a suspect. And they might want to go double back now that we have a lot of DNA technology. That's all I'm saying. I'm just trying to catch a killer, or at least a kidnapper. And I thank you guys for helping. Now, to preface this, let me know in the comments, because I am not a father, but what it would feel like if your only child went missing. So let me know in the comments right now, because you wouldn't know if they were a victim of a serial killer, or if your daughter or son developed amnesia, or didn't know who they really were, or just got lost. So please let me know in the comments. Thanks. Now, I say all this because Hazel Carpenter knew that horrible feeling when her only daughter, Mary Virginia Carpenter, mysteriously disappeared. Now, at the time, Virginia Carpenter was 21 years old, and she had brown hair, brown eyes, and due to an appendectomy, she bore a scar on her stomach, and she also had a limp due to a previous bone-hip infection. And at the time of her disappearance, she was suffering from a severe case of sunburn as well. And she was last seen wearing a white dress with red, green, and brown stripes. Now, from Texarkana, Texas, Virginia boarded a train on June 1st, 1948 to return to her school dormitory in Denton, Texas. And the ride lasted for about 6 hours, so she had enough time to talk to a working teacher named Marjorie Webster. And Marjorie was also from Texarkana, so the two had an instant connection. And when the train was at their destination and the two of them got off the train, they decided to call a cab, and then the cab took them to their respective destinations. And Marjorie was dropped off at the Fitzgerald dormitories, and Virginia's destination was straight to the Texas State College for Women dormitories. So they then hire the service of a cab driver named Edgar Ray Zachary, aka Jack, and when Marjorie reached the Fitzgerald dormitories, Virginia remembered about her trunk luggage, which she failed to retrieve. So because of this, she asked Jack how much it would cost to drive her back to the station, and her and Jack agreed on a price of 75 cents to do so. Now, even Marjorie said that she would accompany her back to the station, but Virginia refused, telling her new friend that she would be all right, everything's good, even if she would be alone. So Jack and Virginia returned to the station, only to find out that her trunk would not arrive until later. So the driver then suggested that he could get the luggage tomorrow and deliver it to her dormitories, and thinking that, that was more than a practical idea, Virginia agreed. So she gave him the claim receipt to the driver inside, and on the back she also wrote down her details, which were Virginia Carpenter, room 200, Breckenridge. And then in the end she gave Jack a $1 tip as an extra thank you. Now, when they arrived at the dorm, Jack claimed that there was a yellow or cream colored convertible out front. And the color was not clear because it was dark and the moon wasn't shining bright that light, plus the street lights were off due to repairs in that area. And standing by the car were two men. One of them was shorter and the other one was a bit heavier. Now, interestingly enough, when Virginia saw the men, she looked surprised, but not in an alarmed tone, because the two men seemed to know her. In fact, as soon as she approached the car, the shorter of the two men lifted her out to the curb, and then she instructed Jack to leave her other luggage on the ground because, you know, the boys would take care of it. So, after fulfilling these instructions, Jack left, leaving behind Virginia with the two unidentified men. Now, Virginia never checked into her dorm, and after this point was never seen again. Now, the next day, Jack took Virginia's trunk to the front lawn as he was instructed to do so. 2 days after that, it was still unclaimed. So it was taken to the office, and on day 3 of Virginia's disappearance, her boyfriend, Kenny Branham, called her mother Hazel because he could not get a hold of her. So Hazel, at this point the mother, became obviously frantic and called the school just to learn that Virginia never checked in. And she didn't even enroll for that summer term at all. So Hazel then called her daughter's friends and their other relatives, but they all have heard nothing. And on June 5th, just after midnight, Hazel filed a missing persons report. So that's when the police said that they would start investigating the case first thing in the morning. And that, you know, Hazel should go and get a good night's sleep first, before all this. But at this point, Hazel became even more agitated. So she went to Denton herself to personally look for her daughter, like any good mother would do. Now, all avenues of searching were employed, including helicopters, motorboats, people that were on foot, like search parties and trackers, and hunters from lakes to abandoned wells. Almost all corners were inspected. But resolving this mystery was still a very tough task. So we got Virginia's disappearance now. And at this point, days and days are going by without one solid clue. And according to her previous boyfriends, the girl was easily infatuated, so it was possible that she took off with a new love interest, but her family, especially her mother, refused to believe any such notion. I mean, Virginia was a loving daughter, and she had great plans. In fact, she enrolled in the school for a summer term so she could pursue a science degree as a laboratory technician. And her boyfriend Kenny was investigated and was even subjected to a lie detector test, but he passed, and nothing more could link him, at least, to the case. Now, the driver Jack also became a hot subject of scrutiny, and according to reports, he had records of abusiveness, but aside from that, no one and nothing could connect him with Virginia's case alone. And his wife also stated that he was already home by 10 p.m., just less than an hour after he dropped Virginia off to her dormitory. Now, the time frame was so short that it would be very, very hard for him to commit the perfect crime in that amount of time. Plus, Jack also took a polygraph or lie detector test, and on both times he passed with flying colors. But the weird thing was, in 1958, Jack's wife changed her statement, and she said that Jack actually was really not home until about 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning on June 2nd. Now, despite this, Jack was never charged with anything due to a lack of evidence, and he became a suspect forever up to the day of his death in 1987. Now, others said that her disappearance could be because of the Texarkana killings, okay? So, 2 years before Virginia disappeared, 5 people were murdered, and it was suspected that the same person did this. Plus, the killer was never identified. Thus, he became known as the Phantom Killer. Now get this. Out of the 5 people murdered by the Phantom Killer, Virginia personally knew 3 of them. Now, could this mean that Virginia really did know 3 of them? Or could this possibly mean that Virginia was actually the Phantom Killer herself? Now, of course, that is a far stretch, and the odds are she was a victim, but I like to keep an open mind. Now, as we weave and dive through the course of the case, many sightings were reported, but none gave any solid clues. I mean, there was even one gas station attendant reporting seeing Virginia together with 2 boys and another girl, and she said that they were in a yellow convertible with an Arkansas license plate. After that, there was Mrs. James, who was a ticket agent in a bus station in DeQueen, Arkansas, and she reported seeing Virginia, and she said that she saw a woman who resembled Virginia together with a man who was about 25 to 26 years old. And she said that the woman, Virginia, appeared to be very nervous and that she asked for available hotels in that area. And when the police showed her 2 pictures, she actually did point at Virginia's photo. However, after some time, she said that she was no longer 100% sure if it was really Virginia Carpenter. Then there was another reported by this woman named Gladys, who mentioned in a letter that they had seen a well-educated girl hitchhiking, and the girl resembled Virginia Carpenter. And Gladys said that the hitchhiker actually said her name was Virginia and that she ran away. But however, these claims have never been substantiated or verified. Now lastly, you have Hazel, the mother, on the other hand, who was a beloved mother of Virginia and believed that her daughter was a victim of amnesia, perhaps. Perhaps she was alive somewhere and she just didn't know how or where to return to. And more than 6 decades later, the hope of ever finding out the truth behind her disappearance is starting to slim down to none. So, I mean, Virginia didn't even tell her mother that she was actually not going to boarding school that summer. So did Virginia run away? Did she? And did she do it for, a possible boyfriend? A new boyfriend maybe? A love interest? And, was she really seen with those 2 guys and another girl? Or did the Phantom Killer somehow get a hold of her? Maybe it was one of the guys she was with that she didn't even know was the Phantom Killer, and sadly, that's how she perished. Was it that, or is there a slim possibility, since she knew 3 out of the 5 victims that the Phantom Killer killed, that she herself was the Phantom Killer? Now, I do not want to put any blame on her, especially if she's the victim. Like I said, I just like to keep an open mind. But I would love to know, since there's a lot of holes and a lot of theories that can be placed around this, I would love to know your opinion in the comments. I'll read every one, and I'll tell you what I personally think of them. Thanks. On May 31st, 1995, a very attractive young woman arrived at the reception desk of the Luxury Plaza Hotel in Oslo, Norway. Now, she was very petite and had short, dark hair, plus was dressed all in black. And she told the receptionist that she had a reservation under the names of Louis and Jennifer Fairgate. From there, she filled out the little registration card, and on it, she gave her address, in which she put down was in Verlaine, Belgium. At that moment, the receptionist didn't ask if Mr. Fairgate was going to be checking in as well. She just assumed the man that she saw lurking in the background behind her was her husband, Louis. So she said, "Welcome to the Oslo Plaza Hotel," and handed her key card to room 2805 and said, "I hope you enjoy your stay." Now, unknown to the receptionist, Jennifer Fairgate just pulled off a trick that most of us could never get away with. She actually just checked into a 5-star hotel without giving her credit card. Now, whether this was merely an oversight of the receptionist remains to be seen. but it is one of the many anomalies that continue to baffle scholars of this extraordinary affair. So Jennifer retreated to her room and she went unseen for the next 3 days. Then eventually the credit card error was picked up and a staff member was sent to room 2805 to resolve this matter. And when the staff member got up there, there was a do not disturb sign on the door, but the employee decided to knock anyway, and there's no way he could have expected what happened next. And from within the room came a loud pop, and he recognized it immediately because it was a gunshot. The staff employee at this point is very alarmed by the sound of a gunshot, so he immediately sprinted toward the corridor and took cover. Then from there, he peered around the corner to keep room 2805 under surveillance. And with bated breath, he expected to see someone exiting the room at any moment. Perhaps it was the person who fired the gun, or maybe the victim who got shot. But in his surprise, the door remained closed during the few minutes that he was watching. So, after seeing nobody enter or exit the room, he ran to the elevator and went to alert his supervisor, and when he returned about 15 minutes later, it was with the head of security in charge. And after knocking on the door and getting no response, the two men decided to enter using a passkey to bypass the double lock. And a horrible smell immediately hit their nostrils right when they stepped in. And that's when they spotted Jennifer Fairgate lying fully clothed across the bed with a bullet hole perforated in the center of her forehead. So they slowly backed out of the room, trying carefully not to touch anything to disturb the crime scene, and the men immediately called the police. Now, from first glance, this would immediately look like a suicide, and a Browning 9mm pistol was clutched in the dead woman's hand, plus the room had been double locked from the inside, meaning that no one exited after the shot was fired. But there were still some things that didn't add up, and these things cast doubt on the initial assessment that it was suicide. I mean, for one, the grip on the gun was more than unusual, with the thumb inserted into the trigger guard and apparently used to pull the trigger. Now, a weapon as powerful as a Browning would have been almost impossible to control with this grip. The only possible way that it might have been achieved was if the free hand was held on the barrel. But in that case, there would have been powder burns, and there were absolutely none on her hands. Also, there was the issue of blood spatter, because blood droplets had launched on the walls and furnishings, and some were even sprayed on the ceiling. Yet, the victim's hands, which would have only been inches away from the bullet wound in this case of suicide, were curiously free of blood. Now, these were absolutely perplexing questions for the police, and they weren't the only questions found inside this hotel room. As detectives tried to confirm the dead woman's identity, they encountered yet another puzzle. This woman had no passport, no driver's license, no credit cards, or any other forms of ID. And then the police looked inside the closet, and the mystery deepened even further. Miss Fairgate had brought a very odd ensemble to the Oslo Plaza, with a plenty of tops, but no pants, no skirts, or no dresses. Plus, this mysterious guest also had no toiletries, except for a bottle of men's cologne. And all the labels had been removed from her clothes for some weird unknown reason. And then there was a very expensive briefcase that was designer made and had brown leather which contained nothing but a supply of bullets for the Browning. 34 bullets to be exact. So the question would be, did Jennifer come here to commit suicide or to start a small war? As for the gun itself, it offered a few clues. First, The serial numbers had been removed with acid, and according to one cop with experience on things like this, it looks like it was done professionally. So one last option remained for the police to identify their victim, the corpse, and it was fingerprinted and the prints were sent to Interpol, hoping for a match. And when that inquiry returned with absolutely nothing, this case, you could say, was at a standstill. Now, the coroner in this case had ruled this death a suicide, so you would think that nothing remained to be investigated, and the mystery woman was buried in an unmarked grave, and she would remain there until 2015, when investigative journalist Lars Christian Wegner took the difficult task that the police failed to complete and was trying to find out what actually happened to Jennifer Fairgate. Not to mention who Jennifer Fairgate actually was. So Wegner came into this case with a number of challenges to overcome. I mean, for one, 2 decades have passed and evidence had been discarded, plus some of it had been sold at a police auction, and witnesses had either moved on or at that point had died. So you could say that all the memories of that incident had faded. Nevertheless, the journalist took this task with enthusiasm. So first, he traveled to Verlaine, Belgium, which was the place that Jennifer claimed as her hometown, and it turned out to be a tiny village of about 3,000 people, and was the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. And yet no one ever heard of Jennifer or recognized her from her picture. Plus, to add to that, the address that she gave was non-existent, because she claimed to live at Rue de la Cité. And even though that street was real, the house number she provided was not. So with the address being a dead end, just as Wagner suspected it might be, his next move was to return to the scene of the crime and to examine the records of Jennifer Fairgate's stay. Now here is where a new mystery would emerge, because until now, the narrative described her as a deeply depressed young woman who checked into a luxury hotel with the main intention of ending her life. And after remaining in her room for 3 days, she'd eventually find enough courage to do it. So she pulled the trigger just as hotel security was about to enter. The records, though, told a different story, because Jennifer had not remained in her room. In fact, her key card had been used several times, and on one occasion, she had been away from the hotel for about 20 hours. So, where was she, or what was she doing that whole time? I mean, did she visit somebody in Oslo? And if so, who? And why didn't that person come forward when the story was all over the newspapers and when the police were appealing for any information? It was yet another mystery stacked upon many enigmas that already riddled this case. But perhaps there was a way of resolving this, and there was a way of identifying the dead woman once and for all, and finally getting to the bottom of this whole ordeal. So the body was exhumed, and biological samples were taken, plus DNA was extracted. This was then submitted to various databases, but regrettably turned up no match. All that could be known was that the woman was of European descent, and she was probably German. Plus, tests on her teeth indicated she was born in the early 1970s and probably spent her childhood to mid-teens in East Germany. And during that time, East Germany was under communist rule. And this revelation surfaced a whole new theory, and it was Jennifer Fairgate was actually a spy. The idea definitely deserves some mulling over, and it would certainly resolve some of the questions surrounding the case, like why had Fairgate checked into the Oslo Plaza under such secrecy? Maybe she was on a mission. And where was she during those missing 20 hours? Well, maybe she was meeting with an asset. So then it goes to who killed her. Well, maybe it was an enemy operative. Plus, there was also evidence in this case which espionage experts would recognize as quote-unquote tradecraft. For one, the removed clothing labels and the professional way in which the serial number on the gun was removed. Now, I mean, this is an exhilarating theory, and it ties off many of the loose ends. However, it's possibly wrong, because espionage operations rely on secrecy, and secrecy relies on cover. So an operative in the field needs to blend in, attracting no undue attention. Credentials, therefore, have to appear legitimate. Passports, credit cards, residence, family history, all of these need to check out if held under intense scrutiny. And this clearly was not the case with Miss Fairgate. And no intelligence agency would send an operative into the field with such an easily falsifiable backstory, especially with no credentials. To do so would put the mission at risk. So, the million-dollar question is, who was Jennifer Fairgate? Was she a possible drug mule? Possibly a high-class hooker? Or a hired assassin? Possibly she was a fugitive from the mob. And all of these ideas have been suggested, yet none of them really holds up. So perhaps the simple answer is the correct one. After all, perhaps she was just a depressed young woman who checked into a glamorous hotel to see some beautiful sights before she took her own life. But there are problems with this theory as well. Just like how we went over the blood spatter, the absence of powder burns, the grip on the gun. So to be honest, when it comes to this case, your guess is as good as mine. So what happened in room 2805 remains a mystery. Maybe one day we will find out who Jennifer Fairgate really was. And maybe one day we will find out, when classified documents become unclassified, that she actually was a spy. Or maybe DNA in the future will provide more insight into what actually happened. Either that, or we'll never know it all. So please, if you enjoyed this, take a moment to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. And share this video with everyone that you know. It's the most important part. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.